What you're looking at right now actually happened. A gun, a ballroom full of billionaires, and a maid who never once flinched. Everyone in that room thought they knew who held the power that night. They were wrong. By the time the sun came up, half of them would be begging her for forgiveness. And the woman holding the gun. She had no idea whose house she was standing in. Hi everyone, welcome back. Before we start, tell me, where are you watching from tonight and which country do you call home? Drop it in the comments, I read every single one. Tonight's story is one of the most emotional ones we've ever told on this channel. About pride, about a woman nobody bothered to really see, and about a secret that was sitting quietly in a mansion the whole time. I promise you, you will not see this twist coming. Let's get into it. Nobody in that ballroom expected the night to end with a gun pointed at a maid's forehead. Grace Miller had folded exactly 400 napkins into swans that afternoon, and her hands still smelled like starch and lavender polish when the first guests began arriving at the Whitfield estate. She wasn't nervous about the party. She was nervous about her mother's medical bill, sitting unopened on the kitchen counter of the small apartment she shared with her younger brother, Caleb, in Trenton, New Jersey. Grace was 29 years old, and for the last 3 years, working as household staff for wealthy families around the tri-state area, had been the only thing standing between her family and eviction. Tonight's job was simple. Serve drinks, refill trays, stay invisible. That was the unspoken rule at events like this. The help existed only in the corners of people's eyes, present but never seen. Grace had learned to live in those corners. She'd learned to smile politely when men in tuxedos looked straight through her, to nod when women in diamonds snapped their fingers instead of saying, "Excuse me." She told herself it didn't sting anymore. Most nights that was almost true. The Whitfield estate wasn't Grace's usual assignment. She had been asked last minute to help staff a private engagement party for Ethan Cole, heir to Cole Industries, and his fiancée Vivian Ashford, daughter of a Manhattan real estate dynasty. It was, according to the society pages, the wedding of the decade in the making. 300 guests, a live orchestra, a cake that reportedly cost more than Grace's yearly rent. What none of the guests knew, what almost no one in that room knew, was that Grace had been coming to this exact house for the past 6 years. Not as a party server, as something else entirely. But we'll get to that. Ethan Cole stood near the fireplace, champagne in hand, looking every bit like a man who had won at life. 32, sharp-jawed, raised into wealth so old it had grown roots. But if you looked closely, and almost nobody did, there was a tightness behind his eyes that never fully relaxed, even at his own engagement party. Vivian Ashford moved through the crowd like she owned gravity itself. Beautiful, polished, and used to being the most important person in every room she entered. She laughed loudly at the right moments and touched Ethan's arm possessively whenever another woman came too close. To the guests, she looked radiant. To the staff, she was a different woman entirely, the kind who called you sweetheart in a voice that made the word feel like an insult. Grace had already been on the receiving end of 2 of Vivian's sharp comments that evening. A comment about her cheap perfume. A comment about how slow she was pouring wine. Grace said nothing. She'd learned that silence protected her more than defending herself ever could. But something in Vivian's eyes had been watching Grace all night. Not with suspicion about theft. Not yet. With something closer to jealousy. Because twice now, she had seen Ethan's gaze drift toward the quiet maid in the lavender uniform a half-second too long. And Vivian Ashford did not tolerate being anything less than the only woman in a room. At 9:47 p.m., a diamond bracelet, a family heirloom worth nearly $200,000, went missing from a velvet display case near the dessert table. At 9:52 p.m., Vivian Ashford began screaming for security. At 9:58 p.m., Her eyes landed on Grace. "It was her," Vivian said, pointing across the ballroom, her voice slicing through the orchestra music like a blade. "The maid. I saw her near that table all night." The music stopped. 300 conversations died at once. Every head in the ballroom turned toward the quiet woman in the lavender dress, holding an empty serving tray, standing perfectly still. Grace's heart pounded so loud she was sure the whole room could hear it. "I didn't take anything," she said quietly. "I haven't been near that table in over an hour." Vivian crossed the room in 7 fast, furious steps. And that was when, in front of Ethan, in front of his parents, in front of 300 of the wealthiest people in the tri-state area, Vivian Ashford reached into her sequined clutch and pulled out a small handgun she'd been carrying since a break-in at her family's penthouse the year before. She raised it, pointed it directly at Grace's forehead. The room fell into complete, suffocating silence. Grace did not run. Grace did not scream. She stood absolutely still, looking past the barrel of the gun and directly into Vivian's eyes, and said 5 words that would change everything that happened next. "You don't want to do this." Nobody in that ballroom understood yet just how true those words really were. For 3 full seconds nobody moved. Not the guests frozen mid-sip of champagne. Not the string quartet, bows hovering above their instruments. Not even Ethan Cole, who stood 20 feet away with his hand halfway extended, as though he could somehow reach across the room and stop what was happening through sheer will alone. Vivian's hand trembled slightly, but the gun stayed level. "Where is my bracelet?" she said, her voice shaking between fury and something raw. Fear of being humiliated in front of everyone who mattered to her family's reputation. "I don't have it," Grace said again calmly. "I never touched that table." "She's lying," Vivian said to the room, though her eyes never left Grace. "Look at her. Look at how calm she is. Only a guilty person stays that calm." What Vivian didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that Grace had learned to stay calm in situations far more dangerous than this one. 2 years earlier, she had watched paramedics wheel her mother into an ambulance after a stroke, and she had learned that panic solves nothing. Calm was the only tool poor people were ever allowed to keep. Vivian put it down. Ethan finally found his voice, stepping forward with both hands raised. "Please. This isn't who you are." "She's been looking at you all night," Vivian snapped, her composure cracking wide open now, months of quiet insecurity spilling out in front of everyone. "I've seen it. And now my bracelet is missing and she's the only one who was near that table." An older woman near the dessert table, Ethan's grandmother, Eleanor's oldest friend, a woman named Margaret Whitfield who had watched this entire family grow up, stepped forward with more courage than anyone twice her age in that room. "Vivian Ashford, put that gun down this instant," Margaret said, her voice cutting through the tension like ice water. "You have no idea who you are pointing that at." Vivian let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "She's the maid, Margaret." "She is not just the maid," Margaret said, and something in her tone made several guests exchange confused glances. "But that is not a conversation for tonight." Grace's eyes flicked toward Margaret for just a moment, a silent plea. "Not yet. Please, not yet." Security guards finally pushed through the frozen crowd, moving carefully toward Vivian, who slowly, reluctantly, lowered the gun as 2 men in dark suits closed in on either side of her. The moment the weapon was out of her hand, the room exhaled all at once, gasps and murmurs rippling through the crowd like a wave breaking. Vivian was escorted toward a side room by her furious father, Richard Ashford, who had gone pale watching his daughter nearly destroy both his family's reputation and, potentially, a young woman's life in front of half of Manhattan's elite. Ethan stood frozen for a moment before rushing toward Grace. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "Grace, I am so sorry. I don't know what came over her." "I'm fine," Grace said, though her hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. "I just want to go home." "You're not going anywhere," came a new voice from the back of the room. Calm, elderly, and unmistakably in charge. Everyone turned. Standing in the archway leading from the east wing was a woman none of the younger guests recognized, but whom the older Whitfield family friends immediately straightened up for. She was in her 70s, sharp-eyed, dressed simply but with unmistakable presence, the kind of presence that came from decades of quiet authority rather than money on display. "Mrs. Caldwell," Ethan said, surprised. "I didn't know you were attending tonight." "I wasn't," the woman replied. "I came because Grace called me an hour ago, worried about working a house this large alone on short notice." She looked directly at Vivian's retreating back, then turned her sharp gaze to the stunned crowd. "I think it's time some of you learned exactly whose house you are standing in tonight." A murmur rippled through the ballroom. Ethan's father, standing near the bar, went visibly pale. "What is she talking about?" Vivian's mother whispered to no one in particular. Grace closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of 6 years of silence pressing down on her chest. She had promised Eleanor Whitfield in her final days that she would never use this for pride or attention. But standing here now, gun barrel still burned into her memory, she realized some secrets were no longer hers alone to keep. "Mrs. Caldwell," Grace said quietly. "Please. Not like this." "My dear," the older woman said gently, walking toward her. "I think tonight already decided that for you." The bracelet, as it turned out, had never been stolen at all. It was found 20 minutes later, tangled inside the folds of a linen napkin that had fallen behind the dessert table during setup, knocked loose by a caterer rushing to refill the champagne fountain. A simple accident. No theft. No crime. Just carelessness, panic, and a woman who had let jealousy convince her of something that was never true. But by then, the damage of that moment had already rippled through the entire ballroom, and something far bigger than a missing bracelet had been set into motion. Mrs. Caldwell, whose full name, as several older guests now recalled with widening eyes, was Diane Caldwell, longtime estate attorney for the late Eleanor Whitfield, stood in the center of the ballroom with the calm authority of someone who had been waiting years for this exact moment. 6 years ago, Diane began, addressing the room as though she were reading a will aloud, which in a sense she was. Eleanor Whitfield hired a young caregiver to help her through the final years of her life, after her husband passed and her own children had scattered across the country, too busy with their own lives to visit more than twice a year. Grace stood frozen, her cheeks burning, wishing desperately she could disappear into the marble floor. "That young woman," Diane continued, "did not just clean this house. She sat with Eleanor through 3 hospital stays. She read to her every night for 2 years when her eyesight began failing. She learned to cook the exact recipes Eleanor's late mother used to make, just to bring her joy on her hardest days. She turned down higher-paying jobs twice, because she refused to leave an elderly woman who had no one else." Ethan's mother pressed a hand to her mouth. Several guests exchanged stunned glances. "When Eleanor Whitfield passed away 18 months ago," Diane said, her voice steady but heavy with meaning, "she left specific instructions in her will. This estate, the house you are all standing in tonight, every room, every acre of this property, was not left to her children, who she felt had abandoned her in her final years." A long pause stretched across the ballroom. "It was left in its entirety to Grace Miller." The room did not just go silent. It went still in a way that felt almost physical. 300 wealthy, powerful people frozen mid-breath, staring at the young woman in the lavender maid's uniform who, moments earlier, had a gun pointed at her forehead. "That's not possible," Vivian's father said from across the room. his voice hollow. "The Cole family has been leasing this estate for the past year for their corporate events. We were told the Whitfield family retained ownership." The Whitfield family name retained the property in public record for privacy reasons, at Eleanor's request, until the estate fully cleared probate 3 months ago, Diane said calmly. "Grace asked me to keep it quiet. She didn't want people treating her differently." She continued working as household staff, including apparently for tonight's event, because she said it was the only life she knew how to live, and she wasn't ready to stop being useful to people. Ethan turned to Grace slowly, his expression a mixture of disbelief and something that looked almost like grief for all the months he had walked past her in this very house without knowing. "You own this house," he said quietly. "The house my family has been renting for the past year. The house we're standing in right now, for my engagement party." "I didn't want it to matter," Grace said, her voice trembling for the first time all night. "I didn't want anyone to look at me differently. I just wanted to finish Eleanor's wishes quietly and keep working, keep helping my family, keep my head down." "And instead," Margaret Whitfield said gently, stepping beside Grace with a protective hand on her shoulder, "you got a gun pointed at your face by a woman who never once bothered to ask your name." Vivian, who had been standing frozen near the side hallway with security still flanking her, went white as chalk. The full weight of what she had done began crashing down all at once. Not just the humiliation of a false accusation, but the horrifying realization that she had pointed a loaded weapon at the actual owner of the estate her own engagement party was being hosted in, a woman who had spent 6 years quietly, selflessly caring for a dying widow while Vivian had spent those same years being fitted for designer gowns and photographed at galas. "I didn't know," Vivian whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "That," Diane Caldwell said quietly, "was rather the point of how she lived, Miss Ashford. Kindness doesn't announce itself. Cruelty always does." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Grace had ever heard in her life. By the time the last guests trickled out of the Whitfield estate that night, whispering into their phones and to each other about what they had just witnessed, the ballroom looked almost peaceful again. Staff quietly cleared champagne glasses. The orchestra had long since packed up their instruments, and Grace Miller sat on the marble front steps of the mansion she now legally owned, still wearing her lavender uniform, staring out at the dark lawn where valets had once parked hundreds of luxury cars for a party that had ended in a way nobody could have predicted. Ethan found her there 20 minutes later, having changed out of his tuxedo jacket, his tie hanging loose around his collar. "Can I sit?" he asked. Grace nodded, and he lowered himself onto the cold stone steps beside her, close enough to talk quietly but respectfully apart. "I owe you an apology too," Ethan said after a moment. "Not just for tonight. For the past year. I've walked past you in this house dozens of times during our corporate events, and I never once asked your name until 3 hours ago. I looked right through you the same way everyone else did." "You're not the only one," Grace said without bitterness, just tired honesty. "Most people do. I got used to it." "That's the part that bothers me the most," Ethan admitted. "That you got used to it. That being invisible became something you just accepted instead of something that made you angry." Grace considered this for a long moment, watching her breath fog slightly in the cool evening air. "Anger doesn't pay rent," she finally said. "Anger doesn't keep your mother's medication stocked, or keep the lights on for your little brother while he finishes high school. I learned a long time ago that surviving and being angry at the same time is exhausting. So I chose survival, and I let the anger go quiet." Ethan was quiet for a moment, processing the weight of that sentence. A life so different from his own that he had never once had to consider it, despite having lived, worked, and celebrated inside a house owned by the woman living that exact life beside him. "Eleanor Whitfield," Ethan said finally. She really left you everything? She left me a home, Grace said softly. Not because I asked for it. Not because I expected anything when I started taking care of her. I did it because she was lonely and scared of dying alone, and because somebody needed to sit with her at 2 in the morning when the pain kept her awake and her own children were too busy with their careers to answer their phones. Grace's voice cracked slightly. She used to say I was the only person who ever really looked at her. Not at her money, not at what she could offer, just at her, as a person nearing the end of her life who deserved kindness anyway. That's the second time tonight you've used almost the exact same words, Ethan said quietly. About being seen. Grace gave a small, tired smile. I guess it's the thing I've wanted most my whole life. To just be seen. Not for what I can do for someone. Not for what I own or don't own. Just seen. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, something in his expression shifting. Not romantic, not yet, but something deeper and more honest than he had allowed himself to feel in years. I see you, Grace, he said simply. I should have a long time ago. I'm sorry it took a gun and a broken engagement for me to actually look. Grace let out a small, surprised laugh, the first genuine laugh of the entire night. That's a hell of a wake-up call. The worst kind, Ethan agreed, smiling faintly despite everything. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while. Two people from impossibly different worlds who had somehow ended up on the same cold marble steps, watching the last of the valet lights shut off across the lawn. What happens now? Ethan finally asked. With the house. With everything. Grace looked back at the enormous mansion behind them, lit softly from within. The same house where she had once fed a dying widow soup by hand, where she had read Eleanor her favorite novels until her voice went hoarse, where tonight a gun had been pointed at her own forehead in front of 300 strangers. I think, Grace said slowly, I'm finally ready to stop being invisible in it. 3 months later, the Whitfield estate looked different, not in its architecture, but in the life that now moved through it. Grace had quit her staffing job the week after the party, not out of pride, but because Diane Caldwell had gently reminded her that Eleanor's dying wish wasn't for Grace to simply inherit walls and land. It was for her to finally live a life she no longer had to fight so hard for. Grace used a portion of the estate's value to pay off her mother's remaining medical debt in full. She enrolled her younger brother Caleb in a private tutoring program to help him catch up before college applications. And she opened the east wing of the mansion, the very ballroom where she had once nearly lost her life, as a community respite center for family caregivers, offering free short-term housing and support for people quietly exhausting themselves the way she once had, caring for a parent, a grandparent, a dying loved one, with almost no help and almost no recognition. She named it simply Eleanor's Room. Vivian Ashford, to the surprise of many who had written her off after that night, did not disappear from the story quietly. Word eventually spread that she had begun volunteering, quietly, without press coverage, without her father's business connections attached to it, at a women's shelter in Brooklyn. She never spoke publicly about the engagement party. But those close to her said something in her had genuinely shifted that night on the ballroom floor, staring down at Grace's calm, unshaken eyes instead of anger. Grace and Vivian never became close friends. But Grace received a handwritten letter from her 2 months later. No explanation needed, no excuses made, just 11 honest words. Thank you for not making me pay for who I used to be. Ethan Cole visited the estate often in the months that followed, not as its former tenant, but as something gently, cautiously new. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was announced to society pages or gossip columns, though eventually, of course, people talked. What mattered more than the rumors was what happened quietly, in the kitchen of that enormous house, most evenings around 6. Ethan learning, slowly and clumsily, how to cook the same recipes Grace had once learned from Eleanor's handwritten cards, while Grace laughed at his terrible knife skills and reminded him that real life, unlike his boardrooms, couldn't be rushed or negotiated. Sometimes the most important lesson a person can learn isn't about romance at all. It's about attention. About who we choose to actually look at in a crowded room, and who we let ourselves walk past without a second thought. Grace spent years being the woman nobody noticed, refilling glasses, folding napkins, standing quietly in the corners of other people's celebrations, while an entire mansion, an entire fortune, and an entire second chance at life sat waiting behind her own quiet, unassuming kindness. Not because she demanded it. Not because she fought for it. But because for 6 years she simply showed up for someone else when nobody was watching, expecting absolutely nothing in return. That's the real twist in this story. Not the inheritance, not the gun, not even the broken engagement. It's the reminder that the people we overlook every single day, the ones serving our coffee, cleaning our offices, caring quietly for the people we've forgotten to visit, are so often carrying entire worlds inside them that we never bother to ask about. So the next time you walk past someone the world has taught you to look through instead of look at, remember Grace, standing calm in front of a loaded gun, in a house she owned but never once bragged about. Remember that kindness, quiet and unnoticed, is still building something, even when nobody's watching. Especially then. If this story moved you tonight, please hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to hear stories like Grace's. Subscribe if you're new here because we tell stories exactly like this one every single week. And if you know someone who needs a reminder tonight that kindness always finds its way back around, share this with them. Thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next story.